Hey, well, John, you became interested in archaeology when you were very young. What prompted that interest?
When I was about 13 years old, my dad saw a notice in the local newspaper, weekly newspaper in Mountain Home, that there would be a organizational meeting of the Twin Lakes chapter of the Arkansas Archaeological Society, and he brought me there. I didn't drive in those days, and we met Bob McGimsey and Hester Davis, and it was all terribly fascinating for me. I don't know if I'd ever thought of being an archaeologist before, but in the ensuing years, I had opportunities to work with them and other people from the University of Arkansas Museum on local field projects, and work with some of the other members of the chapter, and it was the most fascinating thing I've ever done, so I stayed with it ever since.
So from those early days, who were some of the people who were particularly important in helping you get started in archaeology?
Yeah. Well, I'd have to mention Bob McGimsey and Hester Davis. They actually played different roles in my learning. When I think of Bob, I think of he was, in those days, he wasn't known for public archaeology or state and federal policy. He was fresh out of graduate school, and he had a very intellectual approach to anthropology and archaeology, and he, I think, shared that without even meaning to, and that fascinated me. And he used to bring books with him when he talked to the chapter, and I'd look at the books, like Phillips Ford and Griffin's Archaeological Survey of the Lower Mississippi Valley, and on field projects, he taught me the rudiments of mapping with a transit, which I later built on, and then Hester, of course, she was just always encouraging, and I used to prepare site forms like a lot of other amateurs did in those days, and send them in, and she would quite promptly get back to me, usually with a little postcard, the reply typed on a manual typewriter, and with the site numbers of the new sites, and words of encouragement, and that was extremely gratifying that I'd contributed a scientific record to the archaeological site files of the state of Arkansas. And while I'm at it, I want to mention one more person who's not an archaeologist. Pete Shiras was the editor of the Baxter Bulletin, the weekly newspaper in Mountain Home. And I knew his wife was one of my teachers, and I went to school with his daughters. But I never knew Pete much until I was involved in archaeology. He was a person of great intellectual breadth in the context of a small town, though he's very modest about it, and he didn't show it very often. But he would take me with him if he was going to do some field work. I remember we tested a rock shelter in a remote valley in the Ozarks one time, and he used to carry me with him to go to the annual meeting, and I don't think I'd be an archaeologist if it were not today, if it were not for Pete. He was also one of the early presidents of the Arkansas Archaeological Society.
Okay. So the survey was created in 1967, and most of the time we look at that from the perspective of Fayetteville or working with the legislature in Little Rock. You were in Mountain Home at the time. What was your perspective on the founding of the survey viewed from a distance?
Well, I was an undergraduate at Fayetteville,
At
actually,
the time. Okay.
at that time, but back a couple of years earlier, when the idea of an Arkansas Archaeological Survey began to be talked about, proposed by Bob McGimsey and the members of the Arkansas Archaeological Society were great advocates, a great lobby for the creation of the survey by the legislature. But I remember in a meeting about 1965, 1966, that John Moserlich, whom I think he was Memphis, a very active amateur archaeologist, not a pot hunter, but a very conscientious excavator, and worked to a high standard and published. But he one time at the annual meeting, he spoke up and said all the reasons why I thought we needed an Arkansas Archaeological Survey, and he pointed me out in the audience for one reason, so that young people like John House here can have a career in archaeology in Arkansas.
So following that advice, you went to the University of Arkansas, and you were involved in the anthropology program there during its early years. Who did you work with there, and what do you consider some of your most valuable experiences during that time?
Well, that was a long time ago, and I've forgotten a lot, but what I remember most is that I took many courses from Michael P. Hoffman, and there were some archaeology courses, some cultural anthropology regions of the world, and Mike would assign papers, and sometimes I'd go to his house and he would load me up with his own books to borrow and for my work. And I remember one time carrying books home. I dropped a copy of his Swanton's Caddo Indians volume in the mud, and I was pretty dismayed, but when I cleaned it up best I could and returned it to him, he never said a word. So Mike was a real prince among men, and he helped me immeasurably.
So upon graduation from the University of Arkansas, you did contract archaeology for a while, and you were in Georgia and you were in Louisiana, but then you ended up at South Carolina's Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology. How was that like, and how did that organization, how was it like the survey or different from the survey?
Yeah. Well, for background, it was, the way I got there was that the Institute of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of South Carolina developed a program with the South Carolina Highway Department to do surveys mostly in some interstate right-of-ways that were then being laid out and scheduled for work. And Hal Goodyear was their archaeologist. He was the archaeologist with the institute that had that program, and we had worked together on dolphin sites, and even did a field school together in '69, and Al immediately recruited me to be his assistant, and of course, I learned a great deal from Al, lots of methods, learned a lot about lithics. The second part of your question, though, is how the survey and the institute differed from one another, and the institute was more like a traditional academic department plus a contract wing, and didn't have a public archaeology component or there was little emphasis and really little opportunity for the staff and faculty to work with amateurs and just to go out and look at sites and look at collections the way that is standard operating procedure for the survey. Al and many others did that, but they kind of had to really make the time to do it. It wasn't part of their job, and then they weren't given it wasn't part of their job description. They weren't allotted any time to do it, and that was something I missed when I was in South Carolina.
So following your stint in South Carolina, then you returned to the survey,
mm-hmm.
and you worked for the survey for a while. Mm-hmm. You were the assistant at UAPB.
Correct.
And then you went off to graduate school mm-hmm. After having a fairly well-established career of your own in which you published quite a bit. But you went to SIU and worked with John Muller there. What can you tell us, or what would you like to tell us about your graduate school experience there?
Well, the real important thing is that I was fortunate to receive a National Science Foundation Graduate Fellowship, which carried me through a year of master's level coursework into the PhD program. And I think the other thing that really I think is very important from my standpoint is that I was, as you say, I was going to graduate school starting at the MA level mid-career. And I've always been a person who believed in being self-educated, and I think fairly effective at doing that. But when you do that, there are always going to be great gaps in your understanding, and you don't know what you don't know. And I was able to remedy a lot of that, and a lot of the things that I had read on my own that I realized I had not fully understood them. And when I look back, I think that the best of all possible worlds is to start out being self-educated and then have access to formal education at the graduate level. The two really complement each other.
So finishing up there, you came back to Arkansas yet again, mm-hmm. Served for a while as a station archaeologist at Monticello, but then you've spent nearly all of the remainder of your career here at the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, where you've done a remarkable amount of work, and you've studied a wide range of topics in Eastern Arkansas, focusing most often on Mississippi period cultural developments, first encounters between indigenous communities and early European explorers, and you've done some really important work on the emergence of historic era ethnic groups, particularly the Quapaws. What are some of your, looking back on this very productive career, what are some of your most interesting experiences, and what accomplishments are you most proud of?
Well, I think of two areas or research projects that I've worked in on a multi-year basis, and one of them was research on settlement variation and settlement patterning and chronology and ceramics in the what archaeologists call the Kent Phase area, a small area near the mouth of the St. Francis River. And I think of that as archaeology in the mode of science, because I explicitly designed the research, or maybe not from the very beginning, but as I got further into it, I designed it to answer specific questions that could be connected to larger issues. And actually, I had pretty much the nucleus of my doctoral dissertation proposed in mind before I ever went to Southern Illinois University, and of course that's very helpful. But then the other main thing is on the Arkansas River, and I think of this mostly as archaeology in the mode of history. That it's really not focusing so much on broad questions in anthropology as on this historical the Native American history, especially the history of the Quapaws. And I that first became real clear to me when I read Bruce Trigger's article back in the 80s, and William and Mary Porterly on archaeology as Native American history, and realized that from a humanist standpoint that archaeology could have a very big and role to play, and one that I was wanting to be involved in. And I'd always done field work and writing research along the Arkansas River from when I first came to Pine Bluff in 1978, but after the late 90s it was my main focus. And increasingly a very important part of that, and it was very gratifying to me, is that the Quapaws became my partners and collaborators in conducting that research, and they're very supportive and gracious in many, many ways. And I feel that over the course of those years, that partly because of my efforts, but maybe just as much as a matter of serendipity, here I'm referring to the discovery of the Lake Dumond contact era graves near Menard in 1996, and then the following year the discovery of the Wallace Bottom site, which appears to be, well, more than appears to be, the location of the late 1600s Quapaw village of Osatoy, and of the French Arkansas post from the early part of the 1700s. But a lot of the long-standing questions about the early presence of the Quapaws, and I think in a larger sense, this very chronic vexation about statewide about the gap between prehistory and history that really began to come together for the Arkansas River, And if I could have picked something at the outset to try to accomplish while I was in this part of Arkansas, it would be that, and that's happened to a very gratifying degree.
Well, speaking of partners and collaborators, then, most, if not all of your projects have involved avocational archaeologists, and you've worked with members of the general public in a very wide variety of ways. And so, in nearly every respect, your career exemplifies the concept of public archaeology that Bob and Hester envisioned from the very beginning. And so, what is your perspective? Can you sum up for us on the importance of public interest in archaeology and heritage studies in general?
In having that emphasis on avocational archaeologists and members of the general public, I was truly only following in the footsteps of Hester Davis and Bob McGimsey, because that was instrumental to everything that they accomplished. Bob and Hester built a network of people interested in archaeology, probably most of them collectors and not a few pot hunters. And they relied that in developing a statewide program, and then, of course, that was instrumental a few years later in the creation of the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. And so it was just natural, almost unconscious for me to welcome opportunities to work with local people. And I'd say most of the really interesting sites that I've found and things that I've discovered, that non-professionals played a very big role, and probably in most cases I would have never have made these discoveries without their help. And of course, at times when I've done field work, some of these very challenging projects that station archaeologists undertake, usually biting off more than they can chew. But when I've done that, I've never lacked for support, volunteer help from the members of the Arkansas Archaeological Society and other members of the lay public who are interested in archaeology.
Well, John, thank you very much, and we're grateful for you being willing to spend time with us and share insights about your long and remarkable history and experience with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. And I think if Bob and Hester were to look back and identify someone that they were most proud of encouraging, I'd say, without question, hands down, it'd be you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that very kind statement, and I've really enjoyed this, and it means a lot to me, and thank you to everybody for this. Thank you, George. It didn't hurt a bit. Thank y'all.